Stand at the corner of 4th Street and Muhammad Ali Boulevard in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. The Seelbach Hotel rises before you. 10 stories of Beaux-Arts Baroque grandeur, its facade a symphony of carved stone, terracotta, and gilded detail that seems to belong to Paris or Vienna rather than the banks of the Ohio River. The lobby ceiling soars above a checkerboard of Italian marble. Bronze railings curve up a grand staircase. 800 panels of leaded glass form a vaulted dome overhead, catching light and scattering it across the walls like something sacred. This is, by any measure, one of the most beautiful hotels in America. But this is not a story about beauty. Between these gilded walls, in the summer of 1936, a young woman fell more than 6 floors down an elevator shaft and died instantly on impact. Her skull fractured, her bones shattered. Her name changed so many times that she would spend decades buried in an unmarked grave. A man who served as the lieutenant governor of Kentucky was later identified as having argued with her on the 8th floor hours before her death. A coroner's jury ruled her death the result of her own carelessness. No one was ever charged, no one was ever tried. And the hotel, this magnificent, impossible, gorgeous hotel, went right on hosting presidents and derby parties and debutante galas as if nothing had happened at all. This is the story of the Seelbach Hilton, a palace built on the American dream by 2 Bavarian immigrants that became, over the course of a century, a kingdom without law. Where money insulated violence, where power erased inconvenient deaths, and where the most beautiful room in Kentucky has always sat directly above a basement in which, if the walls could speak, they would tell you things that nobody in this city has ever officially confirmed. If you've been following stories about the dark histories buried beneath America's most celebrated landmarks, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and keep exploring. To understand the Seelbach, you have to first understand the world that made it possible. Louisville, Kentucky, at the turn of the 20th century, was not a sleepy river town. It was one of the fastest-growing industrial cities in the American South, a place where bourbon flowed from every distillery district, where the Kentucky Derby had already made the city's name synonymous with wealth and spectacle, where a man with ambition and capital could build something extraordinary in a remarkably short time. This was the age of the self-made titan, the age of Carnegie and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, men who accumulated fortunes so vast they seemed geological in scale, men who built palaces and named institutions after themselves and believed, with a confidence that bordered on theology, that wealth was proof of virtue. The Gilded Age did not ask uncomfortable questions about how money was made. It asked only whether you had enough of it. And in Louisville, in 1869, a 17-year-old boy arrived from Bavaria with no money and no connections and a plan to have both. His name was Louis Seelbach. Louis Seelbach came from Frankenthal, Germany, a small rural town in Bavaria, and he arrived in Louisville knowing almost nothing about the city that would make him famous. He went to work immediately. He took a job at the Galt House, one of Louisville's established hotels, and spent his early years learning the business from the ground up. He was 22 years old when he opened his own establishment, the Seelbach Bar and Grill, and turned it, almost immediately, into a flourishing enterprise. Louisville took to it. The food was good, the bourbon was excellent. The atmosphere was warm and European in a way that felt both familiar and exotic to the Kentucky gentry who filled its tables. Success brought his brother Otto from Germany to join him. Together, by the early 1890s, they had opened the first Seelbach Hotel above the original restaurant, a modest beginning by the standards of what would come, but a beginning nonetheless. And then they looked at their city and decided that modest was not enough. Louisville was expanding rapidly. The Kentucky Derby drew visitors from across the nation and beyond every May. The city's bourbon industry was making men extraordinarily rich. What Louisville needed, what the Seelbach brothers believed their city desperately lacked, was a hotel worthy of its ambitions. A hotel like the ones in Vienna, like the ones in Paris. A hotel so magnificent, so uncompromisingly luxurious that no one who visited it would ever doubt that Louisville had arrived. They hired architects Frank Mills Andrews and William J. Dodd. They broke ground at the corner of 4th and Walnut Streets in December of 1903. And they began building something that would still be standing and still generating controversy more than 120 years later. The Seelbach Hotel opened its doors on May 1st, 1905, just in time for the Kentucky Derby. 25,000 people showed up in a single day to look at a hotel. It is worth pausing on that number. The entire population of many American cities in 1905 was smaller than the crowd that descended on 4th and Walnut to walk through the Seelbach's lobby on opening day. They had heard about the marble, imported from Italy, Germany, and France, 3 countries' finest stone laid into floors and columns and balustrades throughout the building. They had heard about the bronze fixtures shipped from France, the hardwoods brought from the West Indies and Europe, the linens from Ireland, the Turkish and Persian rugs. They had heard that the brothers had spent nearly $1 million on a building they intended to last forever. None of the descriptions had prepared them for what they found. The lobby stopped people where they stood. The vaulted dome of 800 glass panels above the main floor caught the afternoon light and transformed it into something almost ecclesiastical. Carved mahogany detailed every surface. The grand staircase swept upward with a confidence that suggested you had just entered somewhere that mattered. A painter named Conrad Arthur Thomas, famous at the time as the foremost artist of Native American culture in America, had covered the upper walls with enormous murals depicting pioneer scenes from Kentucky's history. Scenes of settlement, scenes of conquest, scenes of a civilization building itself out of wilderness. They were beautiful murals. They did not ask uncomfortable questions about what had been there before the settlers arrived. Down a hidden staircase behind the grand lobby lay the room that most astonished the architects themselves, the Rathskeller. Built in 1907 as part of the hotel's first expansion, which brought the number of rooms from 150 to 500, the Rathskeller was a subterranean hall constructed in authentic Bavarian style, its every surface covered in hand-decorated rookwood pottery created at the famous Cincinnati kiln. The floor, the columns, the walls, the vaulted ceiling arching 12 feet overhead, all rookwood, the clay hand inscribed with designs of walled cities along the Rhine, the archway pillars encircled with pelican frescoes. Above the bar, the ceiling was lined with intricately painted 24-karat gold leaf leather, depicting the signs of the zodiac. A rookwood clock, a $10,000 gift from the Seelbach Realty Company's president, stood at the entrance. No room like it exists anywhere else in the world. The Rathskeller remains, to this day, the only surviving ensemble of its kind. The pelicans on the columns are symbols of good luck, according to the hotel's literature. They are also, in some medieval traditions, symbols of self-sacrifice, of blood, of a creature that feeds its young from its own body. The architects chose pelicans for a room where, in the years to come, people would make choices about who mattered and who did not. Back upstairs, the Oak Room was built in 1907 as an exclusive retreat for gentlemen. Hand-carved American oak paneling on every wall, a private bar, a card room for poker and billiards. It had 2 features not listed in the hotel's brochures. Behind one of the oak panels, a hidden door led to a secret staircase. The staircase led down to a series of underground tunnels beneath the hotel. A large mirror had been installed on one wall, positioned perfectly to allow anyone sitting at the card table to see the entire room and both entrances simultaneously. The Seelbach Hotel had been open for 2 years when these features were added. The brothers built this hotel on Italian marble and Irish linen. They built it to last forever, and they built it with a room that could disappear you if the wrong person knocked on the door. The Seelbach name comes from its founders, but the hotel's identity, the thing it grew into, the atmosphere that clung to it through every decade of its history, was shaped not by the founders' German origins, but by something older and darker in the landscape that surrounded it. Kentucky, the bluegrass state, a commonwealth built on bourbon and horses, and an aristocracy that had, since before the Civil War, operated by a set of rules that bore only passing resemblance to the laws of the United States. A state where who you were determined what you could get away with, where old families and old money and old connections provided a kind of invisible armor that the law simply could not penetrate. The Seelbach Hotel sat at the center of this world. It hosted the derby parties of the bourbon aristocracy. It welcomed the debutantes of Louisville's first families into its grand ballroom for their coming-out galas. It provided a setting in which the highest tiers of Kentucky society could perform their own magnificence back at themselves. And it welcomed everyone those first families chose to associate with, which included, in time, people who had no business being welcomed anywhere. The hotel could not have known what it was being built to become. The brothers were hoteliers from Bavaria who wanted to build the most beautiful establishment in Louisville. They poured their lives into it. They built something extraordinary. they could not have known that what they had created was also, in certain crucial respects, the perfect stage set for impunity. For the first 2 decades of its existence, the Seelbach Hotel was exactly what its founders had intended: Louisville's crown jewel, the address where the most important people in the city conducted the most important business. Presidents came: William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy. The list would eventually grow to 9 sitting presidents. The hotel's suites were accustomed to the particular quiet that descends on a building when the highest office in the land is in residence. That sense of history pressing itself into the walls, of moments that would later be written about in books occurring in rooms that still smelled of bourbon and leather and cut flowers. The Kentucky Derby brought the hotel its greatest annual spectacle. Every first Saturday in May, Louisville transformed itself into a city-sized party, and the Seelbach stood at its center. The grand ballroom filled, the lobby filled, the bar filled. Debutantes in white dresses descended the grand staircase, their photographs taken for the society pages, their futures seemingly as bright and inevitable as the crystal chandeliers above their heads. And then Prohibition came. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment made the manufacture and sale of alcohol illegal throughout the United States. In Louisville, Kentucky, the capital of American bourbon, a city that had been built around the distilling industry, a city where the Kentucky Derby was celebrated with mint juleps, this was not received as a moral improvement. It was received as an opportunity. The money that had funded the bourbon industry did not disappear. It simply moved underground. And the men who moved it, the bootleggers, the rum runners, the organizational geniuses of the criminal underworld, who understood supply chains and distribution and the management of risk, became extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly wealthy in a very short period of time. Wealthy men want beautiful places. They want to eat well and drink well and gamble in rooms that confirm their status. They want mirrors positioned so they can watch their backs. The Seelbach Hotel was waiting for them. Al Capone was not subtle about his presence at the Seelbach. The most famous gangster in America, by the early 1920s already synonymous with Chicago bootlegging, with violence organized into business, with a particular brand of American ambition that wore its ruthlessness openly, came to Louisville regularly and treated the Seelbach like a second home. He took his preferred seat in the Oak Room's carved alcove, where he could see both entrances and feel the reassuring solidity of the wall at his back. He sent a large mirror from Chicago, that mirror still hangs in the room today, positioned so that no one could approach without him seeing them first. When Louisville police got too close, there was a button in the lobby. An employee pressed it, and the doors to the private room swung shut automatically, giving Capone the seconds he needed to reach the hidden door behind the oak panel, disappear into the secret staircase, descend through the hotel's underground tunnels, and emerge, free, untouchable, invisible, on the street outside. He used those tunnels multiple times. Lucky Luciano came to the Seelbach. Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, came to the Seelbach. George Remus, the Cincinnati attorney turned bootlegger, who ran whiskey northward through Louisville's distribution networks and became, in doing so, one of the wealthiest criminals in American history, came to the Seelbach and became there the inspiration for the greatest American novel of the 20th century. Remus was there in the Rathskeller in 1918, when a young Army lieutenant named F. Scott Fitzgerald came down for bourbon and cigars during his training at nearby Camp Taylor. Fitzgerald was supposed to deploy to Europe. He never did. The war ended before he shipped out. He spent his time at Camp Taylor drinking in the Rathskeller, watching the charismatic, flamboyant, magnificent George Remus hold court in the only Rookwood pottery room in the world. Fitzgerald was ejected from the Seelbach at least once for disorderly conduct. He left Louisville having experienced something he couldn't entirely name, the feeling of watching wealth and crime and beauty and violence occupy the same magnificent room without any apparent contradiction. In 1925, he published The Great Gatsby. He set Tom and Daisy Buchanan's wedding in a hotel modeled on the Seelbach, a palace of old-world grandeur where the new money and the old money and the criminal money all dressed the same and danced to the same orchestra and pretended, for the length of a party, that there was no difference between them. There was no difference between them. That was Fitzgerald's point. And the Seelbach is where he learned it. The hotel management accommodated all of this. The bootleggers were good tippers. The police, when they came, could be managed with cash slipped across the lobby desk. The tunnels were a feature, not a scandal. Everything could be smoothed over in a hotel of sufficient grandeur, attended to by staff of sufficient discretion. This was the institutional atmosphere of the Seelbach in the 1930s. This was the culture of the place, a culture in which powerful men did what they wanted, and the hotel looked after them, and whatever happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. It was into this culture, in the summer of 1936, that Pearl May Elliott arrived. Louis Seelbach died in 1925. He had spent 31 years building, expanding, and steering the hotel that bore his family name. He died as its president, in the city that had made him rich, leaving behind one of the most beautiful buildings in the American South. His brother Otto continued for 8 more years, until his own death in 1933. With both brothers gone, the Seelbach Hotel Company, the enterprise they had built from nothing, disbanded. Their descendants sold the property. What followed was a long, slow passage through corporate hands, each owner large enough to maintain the building's exterior magnificence, but none invested enough to preserve the human culture the brothers had created. In 1926, Chicago businessman Abraham Liebling purchased the hotel for $2.5 million. He sold it 3 years later to the Epley Hotel Company for $2 million, already less than he had paid for it. Epley sold the Seelbach, along with his other properties, to Sheraton Hotels in 1956 as part of a $30 million deal that made it, briefly, part of the second-largest hotel transaction in American history. Sheraton renamed it the Sheraton Seelbach, then shortened the name to simply the Sheraton Hotel, as if the word Seelbach were an embarrassment. In 1968, after years of declining revenue in a changing downtown Louisville, the hotel closed entirely. The building that had received 25,000 visitors on its opening day stood empty on 4th Street for nearly a decade, its marble lobbies cold, its grand staircase no longer ascending to anything. The U.S. Department of the Interior listed it on the National Register of Historic Places in 1975, while it was still abandoned. The designation seemed almost like an act of defiance, a decision to preserve something the present had no use for, in hope that the future might. In 1978, Louisville native and actor Roger Davis purchased the building and began a $28 million restoration. The hotel reopened on April 12, 1982, and was eventually rebranded as the Seelbach Hilton. The marble was restored, the bronze was repolished, the grand staircase gleamed again. The Rathskeller, its Rookwood Pelicans intact, reopened as an event venue. The Oak Room reopened, its hidden door and its mirror in place, serving food that would eventually earn it Kentucky's first and only AA5 Diamond restaurant rating. Everything was preserved. Everything was buffed and presented and explained to tourists on guided tours. Everything except the question of what had happened in this building in the summer of 1936, and who was responsible, and why no one had ever been held accountable for it. That question, the management of the Seelbach did not include in the tour. Henry Herman Denhart was born in Bowling Green, Kentucky, on March 8, 1876. He attended Cumberland University and earned a law degree. He practiced in Warren County, where his political instincts, sharp, calculating, cultivated with the patience of a man who understood that in Kentucky, who you knew mattered more than what you knew, moved him steadily upward through the machinery of Democratic Party politics. He joined the Army. He fought in the Spanish-American War and on the Western Front in World War I, where he was wounded in battle and decorated for valor. He returned to Kentucky a brigadier general, his military service adding luster to a political career that was already ascending. In 1923, Henry Herman Denhart was elected the 34th Lieutenant Governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, second in command of a state that took its power seriously. He served as the 36th Adjutant General of Kentucky from 1932 to 1935, head of the Kentucky National Guard, commander of the state's military apparatus. He was also, in those years, the co-publisher of the Bowling Green Times-Journal. He owned an 800-acre ranch outside LaGrange. He had the thick, immovable confidence of a man accustomed to having rooms fall quiet when he entered them. He was 6 feet and 5 inches tall. He weighed somewhere in the vicinity of 250 pounds. He carried a loaded .45 caliber Smith & Wesson service revolver at all times, openly, as if daring someone to ask him about it. His contemporaries described him in consistent terms. He had a violent temper. He was known for public outbursts. He always got his way. He was a brute in the specific sense of a large, powerful man who had learned over decades that the application of intimidation solved problems more efficiently than patience or negotiation. By 1936, Henry Denhart was 60 years old, recently divorced, and spending considerable time in Louisville. He frequented the finest establishments. He was, in every respect, precisely the kind of man the Seelbach Hotel existed to accommodate. He was also, according to evidence that has accumulated over nearly 90 years, quite possibly the man who killed Pearl May Elliott. Her name, her real name, the name given to her by parents who died before she was 9, was Pearl May Elliott. She was born on March 10, 1910, in Davenport, Oklahoma, the second of 4 children born to Annie and Albert Elliott. Her father died when she was 5. Her mother died when she was 8. Both parents gone before she was old enough to understand fully what that meant. She and her siblings were separated into different foster homes, scattered across Oklahoma as if the family had never existed. She grew up in a borrowed house with a borrowed name. Somewhere along the way, she married a man named Charles Wilson and took his name. They divorced sometime in the early 1930s. She kept the name, Patricia Wilson, she called herself now, and moved to Louisville, Kentucky in 1934. She was 24 years old. She was described by everyone who knew her as beautiful, sweet, and well-liked. She had long dark hair and favored blue dresses, and she wore lilac perfume that people remembered long after she had left a room. She had one more reason for the name change, possibly. Around the time she arrived in Louisville, there was an outlaw woman named Pearl Elliott making national headlines for her connection to John Dillinger. The same name, the same first name, the same surname. Pearl Elliott of Oklahoma may have changed her name not only because of her divorce, but because she did not want to be confused with an outlaw. She was living at a boarding house at 847 South 1st Street in Louisville when she died. She was 26 years old. Her landlady later told investigators that she had headed to the Seelbach Hotel on the evening of July 14, 1936, to meet her ex-husband. No one is certain what happened after she walked through the hotel's front doors. What is certain is that on the morning of July 15, 1936, 18-year-old James Embry, a linen sorter working the early shift at the Seelbach, discovered the body of a young woman on top of the dummy elevator car in elevator shaft number 3. Her injuries were fractures of the skull, left knee, right tibia, and fibula. She had fallen at least 6 floors. She died instantly. The Louisville police investigated the death of Patricia Wilson in July and August of 1936. There were witnesses. 2 witnesses placed the former Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky, Henry H. Denhart, on the 8th floor of the Seelbach Hotel that night, arguing with a young woman. Denhart was, at the time, one of the best-known political figures in Kentucky. He was a brigadier general. He was a former adjutant general. He had connections that ran to every corner of the state's Democratic Party machine. He had exactly the kind of power that, in Kentucky in 1936, made investigations uncomfortable and conclusions negotiable. The coroner's jury convened on August 8, 1936. It examined the evidence. It rendered its verdict. Patricia Wilson's death was accidental. The cause was her own carelessness. No explanation was provided for how a young woman comes to fall at least 6 floors down an elevator shaft through her own carelessness in the lobby of a luxury hotel. No explanation was provided for what she was doing in that part of the building, or how the shaft was accessed, or why 2 witnesses had placed a large and violent man known to frequent the hotel arguing with a woman on the 8th floor that same night. The case was closed. Edward C. Langan, the administrator of Pearl Elliott's estate, her sister Ruby, back in Oklahoma, had appointed him after receiving the news of Pearl's death, filed a civil lawsuit in 1937. He charged that General Denhart assaulted, beat, and bruised Patricia and caused her to fall down an elevator shaft in the hotel. Denhart dismissed the claim as absurd, laughable, and ridiculous. He insisted he had never heard of Patricia Wilson. He stated that he was not in Louisville that night and had never been in the Seelbach. He had, by this point, already been charged in the murder of another woman. On the dark and nearly moonless night of November 6, 1936, fewer than 4 months after Pearl May Elliott fell to her death in the Seelbach's elevator shaft, the body of Verna Gar Taylor was found in a ditch along State Route 22 outside Louisville, a bullet wound through her heart. Verna Gar Taylor was 40 years old. She was the owner of the only laundry in LaGrange, Kentucky, a successful businesswoman and widow who had expanded the business her late husband had left her and had become, in the process, financially independent and socially respected. She was known throughout Henry and Oldham counties as, by multiple contemporary accounts, the most beautiful woman in 2 counties. She had dark hair, a sharp wit, and a gift for making people feel immediately comfortable in her presence. She had 2 daughters, Mary, 21, and Frances, 17. She had been engaged to Henry Herman Denhart. The courtship had begun that spring. Denhart, retired from politics and living on his ranch outside LaGrange, had called Verna and noted that 2 lonely people ought to get together. She agreed. Within months, she accepted a ring from him and announced to her family that she planned to marry the general. Her youngest daughter, Frances, objected. She gave no specific reason that was ever recorded. She was 17 years old, and something about this large, aging man with the violent temper and the loaded revolver told her something that her mother was not prepared to hear. By the fall of 1936, Verna had decided to end the engagement. She wanted to return the ring. On November 6th, she and Denhart drove from LaGrange into Louisville and back. Later that evening, according to Denhart's account, they drove again because Verna had a headache and wanted fresh air. On State Route 22, outside the city, the car stopped. Later, the car was found with a flat tire. Denhart's .45 caliber revolver was found 4 feet from Verna's body. Gunpowder residue was found on his hands. Denhart said she had committed suicide. He said she had taken his gun and shot herself through the heart. He said she was despondent about having to break off their engagement. He said she had talked that night of a double suicide, both of them dying together. Kentucky was not convinced. Henry Denhart was charged with the murder of Verna Gar Taylor in November 1936 and tried in Newcastle, Kentucky in April 1937. The trial drew reporters from the New York Times, from the London Herald, from Newsweek and Time and Life. The courtroom filled every day with people who had come from across Kentucky to watch. Verna's 3 brothers, Jack, Roy, and E.S. Gar, sat in the front row every day, their eyes fixed on the man they believed had killed their sister. The prosecution argued that Verna Gar Taylor had been murdered. The defense argued that she had committed suicide. After 20 hours of deliberation, the jury deadlocked 7-5 for acquittal. A mistrial was declared. A second trial was scheduled for September of 1937. Henry Denhart never made it to that trial. On September 20th, 1937, Denhart was in Shelbyville, Kentucky, the night before jury selection was set to begin. He left the offices of his attorney, Rhodes K. Myers, and walked toward the Armstrong Hotel to return to his room. Myers reportedly noticed the Gar brothers stepping from a parked car on the corner of 6th and Main. "Look out, General," Myers said. "There's the Gar brothers." 7 bullets struck Henry Denhart. He died almost instantly on the street in front of the Armstrong Hotel. Jack, Roy, and E.S. Gar were taken into custody within minutes. They were charged with murder. They were later acquitted, the jury finding in effect that what the brothers had done was not murder, but justice. Kentucky had a name for this kind of thing. It was called the Honor Code. And here is the precise and terrible problem at the center of this story. When Henry Denhart was shot on that Shelbyville street corner, the civil lawsuit filed on behalf of Pearl May Elliott, the estate of Patricia Wilson, 26 years old, dead in an elevator shaft at the Seelbach Hotel, was automatically dismissed. The defendant was dead. The case was over. Pearl's sister Ruby Elliott, back in Oklahoma, received a letter from attorney James Robertson. There was not enough money in the estate to cover Patricia's debts. The suit against the Seelbach Hotel had already been dismissed. The suit against Denhart was now dismissed as well. He said she would have been able to read about it in the paper soon, but there was nothing left to pursue. Ruby had lost one sister she had barely known. She put the letters in a suitcase. She put the suitcase in an attic. She did not speak of it again. Pearl May Elliott lay in an unmarked grave in Evergreen Cemetery in Louisville. No one visited. No one left flowers. No one remembered her name because her real name, the one her parents had given her before they died when she was 8 years old, had been buried as thoroughly as her body. What happened to Pearl May Elliott was not simply a failure of justice. It was a demonstration of how justice in Kentucky in 1936 was designed to function. Henry Denhart was not prosecuted for Pearl's death because of what he was. Former lieutenant governor, former adjutant general, brigadier general, member of the bluegrass aristocracy, a man whose connections ran through every institution in the state's legal apparatus, from the coroner's office to the circuit courts. The coroner's jury did not investigate the witnesses who placed Denhart on the 8th floor. It did not ask why those witnesses were not called to testify. It did not examine the physical evidence, how a 26-year-old woman fell 6 floors through an elevator shaft in the lobby of a luxury hotel, in a building staffed by dozens of employees, without anyone hearing anything or running into the hallway or raising an alarm. It simply determined that she had been careless. And it went home. There were, it should be noted, people at the Seelbach Hotel who knew things, staff who had seen things, a building full of employees trained, as all hotel employees at establishments of this kind were trained, in the discretion that luxury required. The Seelbach had been accommodating dangerous men for over a decade by 1936. It knew, institutionally, how to manage uncomfortable information. And it managed it. The hotel went right on hosting the Kentucky Derby parties. The secret room with the mirror remained. The tunnels remained. The Rathskeller Pelicans continued to preside over their basement kingdom, symbols of good luck that had not, as yet, shared their luck with everyone who needed it. Numbers, even disturbing numbers, can become abstract. So, let us remember 3 names. Pearl May Elliott was born in 1910 in Davenport, Oklahoma, when she walked into the Seelbach Hotel on the evening of July 14, 1936. She had lived 26 years with the particular resilience required of a person who had lost both parents before the age of 9, who had been separated from her siblings into different foster homes, who had navigated a marriage, a divorce, a city she hadn't grown up in, and a new name that sat between her and whatever danger her old one might have brought. She was described as sweet, as beautiful, as well-liked by the neighbors at the South First Street boarding house where she rented a room for $1 a day. She walked into the Seelbach Hotel that evening wearing a blue dress. She had long, dark hair. She smelled of lilac perfume. Her landlady said she was going to meet her ex-husband. What we know of her final hours comes from the coroner's inquest, from the civil lawsuit files, and from the testimony of 2 witnesses whose account was apparently not worth following up on. That Henry Denhart was seen on the 8th floor of the Seelbach, arguing with a young woman not long before Pearl's body was discovered at the bottom of elevator shaft number 3. She fell at least 6 floors, her skull fractured, her left knee fractured, her right tibia and fibula fractured. She died instantly on impact on top of the elevator car. She was taken from the hotel. She was identified. She was buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Louisville in a plot she had paid for herself, with a modest service, grieved by the neighbors who had liked her. And then she was forgotten. For 60 years, Pearl May Elliott lay in an unmarked grave. No headstone, no name, no acknowledgement that she had ever lived or that anything had ever been owed to her. In 1992, a doorman at the Seelbach found a 1936 newspaper clipping during a trip to the library, the beginning of a long investigation by hotel historian Larry Johnson into the identity of the woman hotel staff had been calling the Lady in Blue since 1987, when 2 separate employees reported seeing a woman in a long blue dress with long dark hair walk through the closed doors of elevator number 3. Johnson spent years tracing the story. He found the True Detective article from 1955 that named Denhart as the man who had argued with a woman on the 8th floor. He found the civil lawsuit records. He found the name Patricia Wilson. He traced her back to Oklahoma, to a family name, to a suitcase in an attic, to a niece named Billy Laughlin who had been told, as a child, only that an aunt had died in an accident in Louisville. In 2018, Billy's family came to Louisville. They visited the grave where Pearl had lain unmarked for more than 80 years. They brought a headstone. Her name is now on it. Pearl May Elliott, 1910 to 1936. That is the entirety of the formal acknowledgement she has received. No investigation was ever reopened. No apology was ever issued. No official accounting of what happened to her inside the Seelbach Hotel on the night of July 14, 1936, was ever produced. The hotel that bears the name Hilton today still uses the story of the Lady in Blue as a marketing tool. Ghost tours, Halloween promotions, the romantic melancholy of a woman in a blue dress who never checked out. Pearl May Elliott. She never checked out. She was 26 years old. Verna Garr Taylor was 40 years old in the spring of 1936 when she agreed to let Henry Denhart take her to dinner for the first time. She was a widow who had made herself financially independent in a county where that was not expected of women. She ran the LaGrange Laundry, the only laundry in LaGrange, Kentucky, with efficiency and competence, expanding the business her late husband had left her and earning a reputation as one of the most capable businesswomen in Oldham County. She was known, throughout 2 counties, as the most beautiful woman any of her neighbors had ever seen. She was also known as kind, warm, and possessed of a particular grace that made people feel seen when she spoke to them. Her youngest daughter, Frances, had a bad feeling about Henry Denhart from the beginning. Frances was 17. She could not articulate what she knew. On the night of November 6, 1936, Verna was found dead on a rural highway outside Louisville with a bullet through her heart, and Henry Denhart's revolver 4 feet from her body. She was wearing a leather glove on one hand. The coroner found gunpowder residue on Denhart's hands. What the prosecution could not definitively prove, and what Denhart's defense team successfully made the jury doubt, was that a woman of Verna's temperament and social standing would not have been capable of shooting herself in the manner described. The bullet wound, the angle, the weight of the .45 service revolver. These were the details that the prosecution said made suicide impossible, and the defense said made it merely unlikely. 7 of 12 jurors voted to acquit. Verna's 3 brothers sat in the front row of that courtroom for every day of that trial. They never took their eyes off Henry Denhart. When the jury deadlocked, the understanding that moved quietly through the 2 counties was not complicated. The legal system had failed Verna. Her brothers would not. On September 20th, 1937, they waited for him on a street corner in Shelbyville and put 7 bullets in him. They were acquitted. Kentucky had decided finally that justice was what you made it, since the courts were not going to make it for you. But Verna's murder, the murder her brothers avenged, remains officially unsolved. The hung jury means that no court ever formally determined what happened on State Route 22 on that dark November night. Denhart said she committed suicide. The evidence suggested otherwise. The jury could not agree. She is buried in LaGrange. She has a headstone. Her name was in the newspapers for months. She was known, was grieved, was avenged in the specific Kentucky tradition that requires blood to balance blood. She was not forgotten. Pearl May Elliott, the woman who died in the Seelbach 4 months earlier, was. That difference, between the woman whose family had power and the woman whose family had nothing, is the difference this story is built on. There is a third story in the Seelbach's history of violence against women, though this one ends differently enough that you will understand the contrast when you hear it. In 1918, Zelda Sayre, the young Alabama socialite who would later marry F. Scott Fitzgerald, was not at the Seelbach, but the woman Fitzgerald was pursuing at the time, before Zelda, was in Louisville. He was stationed at Camp Taylor. He frequented the Seelbach. He drank excessively. He was ejected from the hotel. He conducted himself, by multiple accounts, as a young man who believed that his talent and his ambition gave him license. The women in Fitzgerald's social orbit during his Louisville period were protected, socially, in ways that Pearl Elliott was not. They came from families with names. They had fathers and brothers who would have known what to do, who would have done, in the Kentucky tradition, what the Garr brothers eventually did. Pearl Elliott had no one. She was an orphan from Oklahoma living in a boarding house. She had no name that anyone in Louisville recognized. She had no family with access to circuits of power and connection. She was, in every sense that mattered to the institutions that were supposed to protect her, invisible. The Seelbach Hotel was a building in which visibility, who you were, who you knew, what you could threaten, determined whether you mattered. Pearl didn't matter. Not to the coroner's jury, not to the Louisville police, not, it seems, to the Seelbach Hotel itself, which allowed the investigation to proceed to its predetermined conclusion and then went back to serving bourbon. These 3 stories, Pearl's murder, Verna's murder, the unnamed women who passed through the Seelbach's rooms during the Prohibition years and left no record at all, are not separate events. They are the same event, told 3 times with different victims and different levels of social protection. They are what happens when a building is designed, architecturally and culturally, as a place where the powerful can do what they like. The Seelbach was that building. It still is, in the sense that nothing has ever been formally acknowledged, nothing has ever been formally investigated, and the institution has never been held accountable for the culture it maintained. The machinery that buried Pearl May Elliott's death did not require a conspiracy in the classic sense, a room full of men deciding together to suppress the truth. It required something simpler and more durable. It required a culture. The Seelbach Hotel, by 1936, had spent over a decade cultivating a specific institutional culture, the culture of discretion in the service of power. The gangsters who had used its secret passages and bribed its staff had taught the hotel what was required of it. You see nothing, you say nothing. The powerful are protected, the inconvenient are managed. Coroner John M. Rhodes convened his jury on August 8, 1936, 24 days after Pearl died. The verdict was delivered quickly, and the reasoning, carelessness, placed the responsibility for Pearl's death entirely on Pearl herself. The system, in other words, did not fail her. She failed herself. The two witnesses who had seen Henry Denhart on the 8th floor were never called to testify. The physical question, how a 26-year-old woman in a luxury hotel manages to fall 6 floors through an elevator shaft through her own carelessness without anyone hearing anything, without any staff member appearing in the corridor, without any alarm being raised in a building with dozens of employees on duty, was never examined in public, under oath, in front of a jury. It was not examined because it did not need to be examined. The conclusion had preceded the process. This is what institutional power looks like at the operational level. Not a deliberate conspiracy, but a set of habits so deeply embedded that they function automatically, producing the necessary outcome without requiring anyone to explicitly direct them. The Seelbach protected its guests, its important guests, the ones who could make problems for the hotel if they were inconvenienced. Pearl Elliott was not that kind of guest. Between 1936 and 1987, 51 years, Pearl May Elliott lay in her unmarked grave at Evergreen Cemetery and was not discussed by the Seelbach Hotel, not mentioned in any official capacity, not the subject of any investigation or inquiry. The hotel changed hands multiple times. It closed in 1968. It was renovated in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It reopened as the Seelbach Hilton. Throughout all of this, the institutional culture that had managed her death remained intact, not because anyone actively preserved it, but because the hotel had never been required to confront it. In 1987, a chef was preparing the Sunday brunch in the Oak Room. He looked toward elevator number 3 and saw a woman in a long blue dress with long dark hair walk through the closed elevator doors. He reported it immediately to security. Within minutes, a housekeeper on the upper floor reported seeing the same woman. Neither of them knew anything about Pearl Elliott. Neither of them had any reason to fabricate a story. They had simply seen something that they couldn't explain, reported it, and gone back to work. The Seelbach staff began asking questions. A doorman traced a 1936 newspaper clipping. Hotel historian Larry Johnson began his research, which would eventually take years and produce a book on the Seelbach's history. And slowly, the story of Pearl May Elliott began to re-emerge, not from any official inquiry, not from any act of institutional accountability, but from the accumulated curiosity of people who wanted to know who the lady in blue was and who she had been before she became a ghost. Here is the precise and uncomfortable fact that the Seelbach Hilton has not adequately reckoned with. The story of Pearl May Elliott, orphaned child, divorced woman, resident of a $1-a-day boarding house, probable murder victim, has been incorporated into the hotel's marketing apparatus. The Lady in Blue appears on the hotel's website, in its ghost tour literature, in its Halloween promotions. Guests are invited to stay in the hotel and perhaps encounter her presence. The smell of lilac perfume, a cool hand on the shoulder in the elevator, a woman in blue moving through closed doors. The hotel has not formally acknowledged that Pearl was probably murdered. It has not called for any formal review of the 1936 investigation. It has not, to any reporter or investigator who has asked, expressed institutional regret for the culture that enabled the suppression of the truth about her death. What it has done is monetize her. The woman who fell 6 floors. The orphan from Oklahoma. The 26-year-old who arrived in Louisville trying to build a life and died on top of an elevator car in one of the most beautiful hotels in the American South. She is now a selling point, a reason to book a room, a feature. Larry Johnson, the hotel historian who spent decades researching her story, who helped identify her real name, who helped arrange a headstone for her grave, who leaves flowers at her grave every year, is the one individual in this story who has treated Pearl Elliott as a human being deserving of care and recognition. He works for the Seelbach Hilton. He is, in that sense, the one person in this institution who has behaved as if what happened to Pearl Elliott mattered. The institution itself has not followed his example. What happened at the Seelbach in the summer of 1936 was not unique to the Seelbach. It was an instance of a logic that ran through Kentucky and the American South, and indeed through American society at large, as a consistent and reliable structural feature. The logic that says that the powerful are protected, that women without resources are expendable, and that the institutions whose job it is to produce accountability are, in practice, in the business of producing its opposite. This logic had a name in 1936. It was called, sometimes, the Old Boy Network. It was called, sometimes, the Honor Code. It was called, sometimes, just the way things work. The way things worked was this. If you were the right kind of person, a general, a former lieutenant governor, a man with 800 acres and political connections, you could argue with a woman on the 8th floor of the finest hotel in Louisville and walk away without anyone officially noting that you had been there. The coroner's jury that ruled Pearl's death, the result of her own carelessness in 1936, was applying the same logic that has produced unjust verdicts in cases involving powerful men and vulnerable women from the founding of the Republic to the present day. The specific iteration of that logic changes over time. Its structure does not. The Seelbach sits on the National Register of Historic Places. It is considered Louisville's historic hotel. Its history is curated and presented to tourists as a series of glamorous stories about gangsters and writers and derby parties. The history of Pearl May Elliott is presented as a ghost story. The questions raised by Pearl's death are not historical curiosities. They are active questions about how institutions protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, and about what it means to commodify a probable murder victim's memory while declining to formally acknowledge what was done to her. The Seelbach Hotel is a member of Historic Hotels of America. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. It is, in every official sense, a treasure of American history. It hosts weddings and derby parties and corporate events and tourists who want to stand in the room where Capone played poker and feel the thrill of proximity to glamorous criminality. None of its official historical designations require it to reckon with Pearl Elliott. No historical preservation law compels a hotel to acknowledge that a woman was probably murdered on its premises, and that the subsequent investigation was structured to protect the man likely responsible. No accountability mechanism exists for this. Pearl's civil lawsuit was dismissed when Denhart died. The coroner's verdict, carelessness, stands technically on the official record, unchallenged by any subsequent proceeding. The Seelbach Hilton is, at this moment, a functioning luxury hotel. Guests are checking in and checking out. The grand staircase is gleaming. The Rathskeller Pelicans are intact. Elevator number 3 is operational. There is no plaque near elevator number 3. There is no memorial acknowledging Pearl May Elliott. There is no formal statement from the hotel acknowledging that what happened in this building in 1936 may have been a murder, and that the subsequent handling of that death by the hotel, the Louisville Police, and the Jefferson County Coroner's Office may have served the interests of a powerful man rather than the interests of justice. She has a headstone now. Larry Johnson put flowers on it. The hotel has not issued a statement. The Seelbach Hilton stands at 500 South 4th Street in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. The marble in the lobby is original. It was imported from Italy, Germany, and France, and it has been maintained with the care that heritage architecture commands, cleaned and polished and preserved, so that the effect of entering the lobby in 2026 is not entirely different from the effect of entering it in 1905. The vaulted dome of 800 glass panels still spreads above the main floor, still catching light and scattering it across the carved mahogany surfaces and the bronze railings of the grand staircase. The murals by Conrad Arthur Thomas, the pioneer scenes from Kentucky's history, are still on the upper walls. The Rathskeller still exists in the basement, descending behind the grand staircase, still the only surviving ensemble of Rookwood pottery in the world. Its vaulted ceiling, its zodiac leather ceiling panels, its pelican-circled columns, they are all still there. The hotel offers tours of the space. It is genuinely one of the most extraordinary rooms in America. The Oak Room's secret alcove still exists, though the restaurant itself closed in 2018 and was converted to a ballroom. The large mirror that Al Capone sent from Chicago is still in the room. The hidden door behind the oak panel is still there. Elevator number 3 operates normally. There is no plaque near it. The hotel hosts ghost tours, particularly around Halloween. The lady in blue, Pearl May Elliott, is the centerpiece. Guests are told that she walks the halls near the elevator. Guests are invited to listen for sounds, to watch for a figure in blue, to lean into the mystery of a beautiful and romantic ghost who haunts the most beautiful hotel in Louisville. The marketing materials do not say, her name was Pearl May Elliott. She was an orphan. She was 26 years old. She was probably thrown down an elevator shaft by a man who served as the lieutenant governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. The coroner ruled her death the result of her own carelessness. No one was ever charged. Her estate's lawsuit was dismissed when the suspect was killed by a separate victim's brothers before the case could be tried. She lay in an unmarked grave for more than 80 years. The hotel's materials say, the lady in blue, a ghost, a mystery, a story. She is on the National Register of Historic Places. In a way, her death is part of the history of the building that is listed, but she is not named. She is not acknowledged as a victim. She is acknowledged as an atmosphere. The Seelbach Hilton is owned by Columbus-based Rockbridge Capital, which purchased it in 2017. It is operated as a full-service Hilton property. Room rates are consistent with luxury, historic hotels in major American cities. There are 2 Seelbach hotels. The first Seelbach was built by 2 Bavarian immigrants who arrived in America with nothing and built, through 30 years of labor and vision, one of the most beautiful hotels in the history of the American South. They imported marble from 3 countries. They commissioned the only rookwood pottery room in the world. They built a dome of 800 glass panels above a lobby that made 25,000 people show up in a single day to stand in it and look up. The first Seelbach was a monument to what the American immigrant experience was supposed to be: work, ambition, craft, and the tangible results of all 3 rendered in stone and bronze and Irish linen. The worst the first Seelbach did was welcome the wrong people too generously. It tolerated too much for too long in the name of hospitality and the peculiar moral mathematics of a building that serves the powerful. The second Seelbach was a building with a culture, a deep, durable, structural culture, in which the powerful were protected and the vulnerable were managed, in which discretion was deployed not in service of harmless privacy but in service of impunity, in which a 26-year-old orphan from Oklahoma could fall 6 floors down an elevator shaft and be ruled the architect of her own death before the body was cold. The second Seelbach is the one that is still operating. It has different owners now and different staff, and its ghost tours are, in one sense, the closest thing to reckoning that Pearl May Elliott has ever received. At least someone is saying her name. At least someone is pointing toward the elevator and acknowledging that something happened there. But naming her as a ghost is not acknowledging her as a victim, and the difference matters. Who exactly argued with Pearl May Elliott on the 8th floor of the Seelbach Hotel on the night of July 14, 1936? Why were the 2 witnesses who placed Henry Denhart on that floor that night never called to testify before the coroner's jury? How did Pearl fall 6 floors in a luxury hotel without anyone hearing anything? Why has no formal inquiry been undertaken in the 90 years since her death? Why has the Seelbach Hotel never issued a formal statement acknowledging that the investigation into Pearl Elliott's death may have been inadequate? What documents from the original investigation, if any, still exist in the Jefferson County records? Does Rockbridge Capital know what it purchased in 2017? Not just the marble and the rookwood and the Hilton franchise agreement, but the institutional history, the ghost in the elevator, the woman who has been waiting for 90 years for someone with the authority to do so to say that what happened to her was wrong? Pearl May Elliott's headstone now stands in Evergreen Cemetery in Louisville. Larry Johnson leaves flowers there. The marble in the lobby is still original. The elevator still runs. And the question of who put Pearl May Elliott in that shaft has never, not officially, not formally, not in any proceeding that would carry the weight of institutional acknowledgement, been answered. Some buildings are constructed to celebrate civilization. Others become the proof that civilization was never quite what it claimed to be. The Seelbach is both. It is one of the most beautiful buildings in the American South. And somewhere in its official record, filed under accidental carelessness, is the case of a 26-year-old woman who deserved better from every institution that touched her story. She still does. The only official verdict in the death of Pearl May Elliott, a 26-year-old orphan from Oklahoma, probable murder victim, permanent resident of the Seelbach Hotel's mythology, is that she was careless. It has never been revised. Asterisk.